All right, I will say. Good. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I will say good morning, a good tevach, such as Chos Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin what will be this is going to be our only full week of Horayos. Only full week, a little bit last week, full week this week, next week already, we're finishing in Mirz Hashem. So we begin by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tosim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shum Drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for Elul Abalinu Latova Ben Goldberg, for Alinias and Shama for his parents, Avram Ben Asher Pinchas, Figurezel Bas Zelig, and I hope that the tefillos of our Kehillah and Klal Yisrael will be accepted on high. Shmuel Libadinovitz Leili Nishmas, David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Haravi Yitzchak Aryeh Ben Achav Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Slav and Aliyah, the families, Ein Nachama, all those in the refuah should have together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, the Kodesh Baruch Hu should Mirz Hashem bring home our hostages b'shalom and b'karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol maaseh yedehem. So with that, let us begin. We have a really, really exciting daf ahead of us today. Like really exceptionally exciting. I'm not just saying that, actually it's the truth. Today's daf is daf love. And tremendous shkrak to Rabbi Richter for really covering a great amount of ground yesterday. We are picking up on Ham with Bays, 5b, 3 lines up from the bottom. Tanya. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Ma Talmud Lomar, Upar Sheni Ben Bakar Tikach Lechatos. So we'll say context. This is talking about, again, when the Leviim were inaugurated for service in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Torah over here details the karbanos that they're supposed to bring. So what does it say? They should make one of them into a chatos and one of them into an olah. Yochol tehi ne'echeles chatos Leviim. You might have thought that the Leviim would have consumed the chatos. Talmud Lomar Upar Sheni li olah. Therefore, the Torah says the second part will be for an olah. It's comparing the two. How so? Ma ola lo ne'echel. That's top of vav. Just like an ola is not consumed, af chatos lo ne'echeles. So to a chatos is not consumed. Okay. Kiyotsebo. We're supposed to get ready for this kimar. This is really tremendous. Kiyotsebo. Rabbi Yossi. Haboim me'ashevi hagola. Hikrivu olos lelokei Yisrael. Parim shnei masar. So we'll say this is a pasuk from Ezra. A pasuk from Ezra. I'll say, so, last night by Shalosh we had the great schos to have Rabbi Shmuel Silber with us for Shalosh. It was really like, it was such a, those of you who were here, it was really like such a special and beautiful event. And as I mentioned when I introduced him, so part of the incredible Zubman method is the emphasis on incremental acquisition of knowledge. It's starting from Tanakh. So I'll tell you, the whole time I'm thinking, whatever you do, don't ask us a question on Navi. I'm just hoping, because again, we wanted to put a good foot forward. Don't ask us a question on Navi. So I'll say, but all kidding aside, what you begin to realize is, because many of us, and I include myself in this, have this huge gap in our education, right? There are those of us here who have finished Shas. Those of us here who have finished Shas more than once. And amazingly enough, yet with all of that knowledge, I think we often find there's this gaping hole in like our Judaic knowledge with Navi. It's one of the projects I think we're going to take on in Mirz Hashem as we go into Tafshin Pei Vav, something to do really with focusing on Tanakh, because you miss out some of the most beautiful things over here. This pasuk from Ezra is talking about when the Jews returned to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. And we're going to actually spend a little bit of time on this, and it's a gripping and moving account. So the pasuk says, Haboim me'ashevi, those who went ahead and came back from captivity. Bnei Agola, the Jews of the diaspora, Hekrivu olos delokei Yisrael, parim shnei masar, so they went ahead and they offered up, literally karbanos, to the God of Israel, parim shnei masar al kol Yisrael, 12 cows, calves, on behalf of all Klal Yisrael. Elim tishim v'shisha, rams 96, kivasim shivim v'shiva, sheep 77, tzvirei chatas shnei masar kol ola l'Hashem. So these are the karbanos that they came back when they were offered up by essentially the inauguration of the second Beis HaMikdash. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Hakol Ola. The pasuk says everything was an Ola. The Gemara says, really? Hakol Ola? Everything was an Ola? That's not true. Efshar, we'll say, Vav Amud Aleph 6a, 4 lines down from the top. Efshar Shechatas Ola says some of them were Chatas. So if they were Chatas, it can't be an Ola. Ela Hakol Ki Ola. all of the karbanos that were offered were treated like an ola. How so? Ma'ola lo ne'echeles, av chatas lo ne'echeles. Just as an ola can't be consumed, so to the chatas wasn't consumed. So there were some unique, we'll call it carbonic peculiarities by these specific offerings. This is fascinating, I will say. Why were these karbanos brought? So the Gemara suggests that many of these karbanos were brought ultimately again as an atonement for the idolatry that Klal Yisrael worshipped. Now watch this, it gets more interesting. Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Sidkiyahu was the last king during the first Beis HaMikdash era. So ultimately, I should say the last king before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So this is interestingly enough, the karbanos they brought were not for the avodah zarah that they worshipped during Babylonian diaspora, but rather again it was for the avodah zarah that they worshipped at the end of the first temple period, under the days or under the leadership of Tzidkiyahu. Now, it's important to understand, Tzidkiyahu was a tzaddik. So it's one of these interesting dynamics in general about how much is a leader responsible for the actions of his constituents. It's usually like a din in leadership. On one hand, clearly the flock goes ahead and a little bit to a degree mirrors the leader. But on the other hand, we find many times where you could have the greatest leader in the world and the flock just doesn't do what they're supposed to do, right? Klal Yisrael had Moshe Rabbeinu. Yet they built the Egel and they went ahead and they did the Meraglim within just a couple of years of each. Like in other words, like within a year of each other. Like it's a pretty incredible thing if you think about it. Now, what does that mean? Is that the reflection on Moshe Rabbeinu? Is that a reflection on Moshe Rabbeinu? Again, so it's interesting to note you have like these cases in leadership study where a leader could be doing all the right things, but lavdafka that the constituents are following along. So it's just important to understand Tzidkiyahu was a great man. He was a great tzaddik. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, there was rampant idolatry. Now, important to understand, he inherited a lot of these dynamics also. So in any event, so listen to what's happening over here. The Jews who came back from Babel, which means you got to remember, Babylonian diaspora, more than 70 years since the days of Tzidkiyahu, are now coming back, and they're part of their carbonic process is offering atonement karbanos for the avodah zarah during the waning days of the first Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. So Bishlam Rabbi Yehuda, so we'll say, now let's go back for just a second. So remember again, I will say, this whole sugya is embedded in our previous machlokes, which is in general, how does par helam davar minat tzibor work? Right? How is all of this working? Is it ultimately, again, is it the basin that's bringing the carbon? Is it every shevet that's bringing the carbon? So listen to this. The Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this makes sense. You could bring 12 chatos. How so? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, again, there's a par helam davar minat tzibor for each tribe. So therefore, again, there would be 12 chatos, one for each tribe, representing the tribal, commission of idolatry. Inami dechatu shiva shvatim ushara ushar incha begrera. Or it could very well be, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if the majority of Klal Yisrael sins, the minority is dragged along with them. That's how you could have ultimately again 12 chatos. Well, the Rabbi Shimon Mishkach, according to Rabbi Shimon also, you could find this case how it could go. The chatu achadasar shvatim, the maisu achadasar sirim, the idich the bezdin. According to Rabbi Shimon holds it's both the tribes and the bezdin that brings the par. So ultimately, again, you could have 11 tribes that sinned, and Bezdin brought one. In other words, because remember, the pasuk said they brought 12 chatos. So according to Rabbi Shimon, it could be 11 tribes sinned, and the Bezdin also has to bring one. That's 12. El Rabbi Meir, the Bezdin medin v'lo tzibor shnei masayich mishkachasla. But Rabbi Meir, you hold that halacha l'maisa again. Only the Bezdin brings the par. The Shvatim do not. So where does 12 come from? Where does 12 come from? The Gemara says, listen to this. Mishkachas leikigon dechatu v'hadar v'chatu v'hadar chatu at sheisar zimni. It could happen. It could happen that they sinned 12 times. Like in other words, there were 12 independent events, and therefore again they brought 12 parim for that. I know what you're thinking to yourself, 12 events, that's ridiculous. How can you not learn your lesson? Really? Really, right? Look in the mirror, I can ask that same question of myself. I'm always making the same mistakes in life, very rarely. I'm not really a mechadish. Right? I don't really make chidushim in terms of averos. Rather, again, it seems to just be the same stuff, the same mistakes over and over and over. As much as we want to learn from our mistakes, sometimes we find ourselves in a perpetual cycle of making the same mistakes. Now, here's the good news. Even if you made the same mistake 12 times, you could break the cycle. But even if you break the cycle, we know you may fall off the wagon again, but that's okay. I was saying, Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. The avoda of life is not perfection. The avoda of life is just getting back up in the aftermath of failure. So we'll say, now here's the bigger problem. So let's get this straight. When the Jews came back with Ezra for the second Beis Hamikdash, they were bringing the sin offerings for the idolatry under the days of Tzidkiyahu. Only one little small detail, only one small problem, which is, Bepashtos, the Jews who worshipped idolatry under Tzidkiyahu were dead. We're dead already. Right? This is over 70 years earlier. Right? So remember again, think about this just a moment. In order to have liability during the days of Tzidkiyahu, you had to be what? At least 13 years old. So what's the probability that now at 83, people are still in the vast majority must have already passed away. So the Lamaisa, again, how can this new generation bring an atonement offering for the Avodah Zarah of people who already died? Rapapa says, so we'll say, now, by the way, what this question is really predicated on is as follows. The Jews who worshipped idolatry under the days of Tzidkiyahu ultimately, again, were chay v'chatos. Okay, what's the halacha of chatos shemesu ba'aleho? We've seen this many times throughout Shas. Ruven, a simple case, we'll say. Ruven goes ahead and accidentally violates Shabbos. Okay, he has to bring a carbon chatos. Okay, Ruven dies. Right, children go ahead and get it, and in their Yerusha is this chatos. What do you do with it? Nothing. Actually, this is one of the cases where you have to let the chatos die. You can't bring a chatos posthumously. And you can't. So if the owner of the chatos died, someone say, I understand. The quote unquote the owners of this chatos, meaning the previous generation of Tzidkiyahu, Bepashtos died. So how can this new generation bring a carbon chatos on their behalf? Amra Papa, listen to this. When do we say that if the owner of the chatos died, you can no longer offer up the chatos? That's an individual. Avalo b'tzibor. But ultimately, again, it doesn't apply to the congregation. In other words, if the tzibor has a chatos, they have to bring. There's no right. Even if members of the tzibor die, ultimately you still bring the chatos. What I say? Get ready for perhaps one of the most powerful lines in all of Shas, maybe in Kol HaTorah Kula. Lefi she'ein misa b'tzibor. Wow, because there is no such thing as death in the tzibor. The Rebbe say individuals die. The tzibor of Klal Yisrael is always alive. The ein misa b'tzibor. If you're by yourself, you could die. You're part of the tzibor. Ultimately, again, the tzibor is promised eternality. I will say, understand the profundity of these words on so many different levels. Ein misa b'tzibor. So I will say, first of all, this is the nitzkias of Klal Yisrael. This is why I will say, this is why no matter what we face, right? No matter what we face, no matter what we're staring at. Yes, often what we're scared about is what's going to be the collateral damage, what's going to be the level of sacrifice we're going to have to make. But our success, our eternality, our national longevity, that's never in question. Why? I say it's in Mefurish Gemara Maseches Horayos Daf Vav Amud Aleph. Ein misa b'tzibor. The tzibor of Klal Yisrael always lives. And Abba say teaches us another important lesson, which is, as we go through life, we think about our contributions and what we want to make and what we want to do and why we're here in this world. Abba say, if my life is just about me, and my goal is just to build the best version of me. So just understand, that's beautiful. There's only one danger with it. If all you do in life is build you, then when you die, you die. Individuals die. And I will say, let's be honest, individuals are forgotten, right? Think about this just a moment. How many of us even know who our great-great-grandparents were. And that's only 4 generations, great, whatever, 5 generations. That's maybe you know a name, maybe probably don't even know a name. Individuals die. But if you use your lifetime to make a contribution to the klal, you do something to make a contribution to the tzibur, that again, I'm not just living in my own dalaramas. I'm not just doing what works for me and my friends and my smaller, but I figure out, you know what can I do to make a contribution to the klal? And Abba said, what that means is sometimes putting your own personal needs on the side and figuring out what can I do for the greater community, whatever community means, your kehillah, your shul, your greater community where you live, Klal Yisrael. See, Abba was saying, we're so often focused on what I need. Here's what I need. And even if I'm going to do something bigger than me, I'm going to do it only in a way that works for me. You can do that, but just understand, after 120, no one will remember you. And even if you found, okay, that's not true, my kids, okay, good. Give it 2 generations, no one will remember you. But if you make your investment in the tzibur of Klal Yisrael, if you put your kochos into building the klal, something bigger than yourself, not just your little corner, not just surrounded by your couple of friends, if you put your investment in the klal and the tzibur, that gives you eternality. That gives you eternality. Why? The fi she'ein misa b'tzibur. Most incredible thing about say we have to really work on becoming kehillah Jews, community Jews, Klal Yisrael Jews. And again, people think that, but I don't have money to do that. It's not money. I mean, money's good, right? But I'm saying it's not just money. It's your time. It's your effort. It's almost saying, do you know how much stress is created in shuls throughout Klal Yisrael? Because everybody needs just like, I need it like this. I need it like that. Imagine for a moment if everybody said, I'm going to stop making it about what I need. Roll up my sleeves and help build everything that's around me. It's not about you. It's not about you. It's not about any of us as individuals. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself. If you can embed yourself in that, you have eternity. It's just going to be about what you and maybe a couple of select people need. It's nice, it's beautiful, it could even be holy. It's never going to be eternal. Embed yourself in the collective, and that will give you your neshama and your legacy eternality. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows: Where do we know that from? Where do we know that from? I will say. Where do we know ultimately again that Emi Sabit Sibur? The Rapapa, the Gemara says. I'm sorry. The vision is Minali the Rapapa ha. Ilim medichsiv tachas havosechi yubanechas. Well, he quotes David HaMelech. Tilim. David HaMelech says it's a beautiful pasuk. Tachas avosecha yubanecha. Literally, again, the sons will come in the stead of the father, which seems to indicate to us what? Which indicates to us that halacha lamaisa, again, the sons, in other words, the sons will pick up where the father's left off. Well, then again, that's singular, right? In other words, that should mean that even the individual has eternality, because halavai person has children. Those children are mamshich. This is fascinating. Rav Papa's diuk ultimately again is from the seir of Rosh Chodesh. The Amar Achmana Maisi Mitrumas Halishka. This is fascinating. So we'll say the seir of Rosh Chodesh, which is a fascinating carbon in and of itself. If you look at Rashi, this is right-hand Rashi, about middle of the short line. Misir de Rosh Chodesh, the Havi Chatas. So we'll say this is fascinating. Right? Remember again, on Rosh Chodesh we bring a carbon Chatas. The Amrach Mana, the Nesu Mitrumas Halishka. Now we'll say, by the way, why is there a carbon Chatas on Rosh Chodesh? So we actually learned this in the beginning of Shavuos. Right? So ultimately, again, the Chatas of Rosh Chodesh is mechaper on certain types of communal tumah. Also, the Gemara says, Chash Baruch Hu says, Heviu alai kapara, bring from me a chatas, bring from me atonement. Why? Al shemi'atati es hayareach. Chash Baruch Hu says, again, this is like an atonement, whatever this means, an atonement for Hashem, that he diminished the power of the moon. Okay, a different time. So Gemara says as follows. So interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says that we go ahead and we bring a carbon chatas on Rosh Chodesh. Now, interestingly enough, the carbon of Rosh Chodesh is brought from the Trumas Halishka. What's Trumas Halishka? General collection fund. Remember, again, everybody would contribute a machzas a shekel, and then they would take from that for communal karbanos. So the chantos of Rosh Chodesh was brought from communal funds. Rashi continues, the chol karbanos tzibur mitrumas halishka hein bain v'ha dilma ma'isi l'humi Yisrael la'achar shnitshma trumas halishka. So as I say, here's what's interesting. So interestingly enough, they would bring the chantos of Rosh Chodesh from the communal fund. From the communal fund. Now the Gemara says, but how can you do that? After all, maybe someone died. Right? Maybe someone died from the time that you separated until you offered it up. So the Gemara says, but one second, how could this be? So you have to bring a communal chatos from community funds, but maybe between the time that you separated out and offered it, maybe members of Klal Yisrael died. And how can you offer up a carbon whose owners died? What do you see from here? That a misa b'tzibor, there is no death within the tzibor, and therefore Allah Chalamais, that's where Baba gets it from. To which goes Alishmamina chata shemesu ba'ala b'tzibor karba. What do you see from here? That it's only by an individual chatos, if the owner dies, that you can't offer the carbon. But by a communal chatos, even if some of the owners die, ultimately you can still offer it. Again, we'll say, let's go full circle. What are we trying to figure out? Remember what we're trying to figure out over here? How could it be that by the inauguration of the second Beis Hamikdash, they brought sin offerings for Avodah Zarah committed during the times of the first Beis Hamikdash? Didn't the people who need that carbon already die? So which Papa said, Ein misa b'tzibor. The Gemara is now just trying to figure out, where do you know that from? The Gemara says as follows: Mi dami sirash chodesh. I don't understand. How can you compare this? Dilma lo ma'asim b'tzibor. There's a very big difference. In other words, maybe no one died. Maybe no one died in Klal Yisrael from the time that you separated out that carbon and you offered it. Maybe no one died. That's a big difference talking about more than a 70-year gap, right? That's not a fair comparison. At the time of the Rapap Mehacha, rather Rapap understands it from here. The Chsiv, Karpa li'am chleis Hashem, Padisa Hashem. Pasuk says, we will say, this is interesting, this is by Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa, again, decapitated calf. You find someone murdered between two cities. We don't know who murdered him. Measure to the closest city. Elders of that city come out, decapitate the calf, wash their hands over the calf. Okay, more to the process, but that's the Cliff Notes. So Gemara says, so they say, as they wash their hands over the calf, they say, Kapra li'am chayis asher padisa Hashem. Literally again, Kapra li'am chayis Hashem, atone for your people. Asher padisa. Now, both say the rest of the pasuk is, so the Gemara is like this: interestingly enough, if you look at the wording over here, the elders are saying, Hashem, atone for your people whom you redeemed. What redemption are you talking about over here? So Pashas the Gemara says, Mitzrayim, even from Egypt. So Egla Rufa is so powerful that it's atoning even for Jews who left Egypt. Now you're going to say, what's the status of the Jews who left Egypt? What's the status, right? Then Neshama Shav and Aliyah, they're dead. They're dead. So what are you talking about over here? That there should be atonement for people who are dead? Gemara says, so what do you see from here? So you see from here that a chatos has the ability to atone even if the owners already died in a tzibor. So the Gemara says, come on, Midam, how can you compare that? Hasam kulu isninon migo de mechapra chayim mechapra nami amesim. That's not a fair comparison because by Egla Arufa, all the people who do need kapara are presently alive. Okay, so now that it's going to atone for the living, it could also atone for the dead. Elahacha mihavu chayim. But we'll say this is fascinating. By Ezra, by the second Beis Hamikdash, it's quite possible that there was no one alive from the days of Tzidkiyahu. There's no one alive from then. So how can you atone for people if no one from that original group is alive? Rabbi say this is an overwhelming Gemara. Get ready for this. It turns out, listen to this, that there were a lot of Jews alive during the inauguration of the second Beis Hamikdash who saw the first Beis Hamikdash. Incredible. 70 years later. Now, where does the Gemara get this from? This is shocking. The Gemara says, Dichsiv, v'rabba me'akohanim halavim v'rashei avos. So the pasuk says, interestingly enough, there were many of the Kohanim and the Leviim and heads of households, hazikenim, asher ro'u as habayis harishon, biyastu ze habayis beinim. So the pasuk says explicitly, There were many Kohanim, many Leviim, many heads of families, many elders who were still alive. First again, Abba said, can you like imagine that? Can you imagine being one of those Jews, right? We've been waiting 2,000 years just to catch a glimpse of our beautiful Bayis Shlishim Yehi Zocha T'Simhera B'Yameinu. Can you imagine again those Jews who were Zocha to see destruction and then Baruch Hashem able to see rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash? So apparently there were a lot of them. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Now remember, all the pasuk says is what? All the pasuk says is that there were a lot of Kohanim, Leviim, elders. There were a lot of people. It doesn't say they were the majority, right? It just says that there were a lot of them, but still maybe they were, in the great context of Klal Yisrael, still considered to be a minority. The Gemara says, no, listen to this. Listen to this. First white line. Suppose that this is wild. The Gemara says that when Klal Yisrael saw the second Beis HaMikdash, the sound of crying eclipsed the sound of joy. I will say this is fascinating. There were two different reactions when they saw the Beis HaMikdash, second Beis HaMikdash, right? There was the cries. Now, but Pashas, the Gemara is assuming, who did the crying come from? The crying came from the Jews of the first Beis HaMikdash, and the second, and the cries of Simcha came from the Jews who never saw the first Beis HaMikdash. So I will say, isn't this incredible that in general, so before let's finish the proof, so therefore the Gemara says the fact that the crying was louder than, I guess, I don't know, we'll call the sound of joy, indicates to us what? That there were more people crying than being joyous, which indicates that something fascinating, that apparently the majority of Jews who came back and saw the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash were leftovers is the wrong word, but we're holdovers, right? We're part of that generation who saw the first Beis HaMikdash, which is wild, which also tells you apparently just about the longevity of those individuals. There must have been a lot of elderly people. But I will say, but this is incredible. So Gemara says the fact that the crying was greater than the joy, ultimately again indicates the majority of Klal Yisrael were in fact holdovers from the first temple era. I will say, to me, it's also so profound that whenever Klal Yisrael rejoices, it's an incredible thing. Our rejoicing is always a mixture of two things. There is always laughter and tears, even in the greatest simcha. I want to say, think about this for just a moment, right? What's going to happen when we have the third Beis HaMikdash? You could see this replaying itself. You could see on one hand, probably the tears are going to flow like water. Because in that moment, when we are Zocha, Amiras Hashem, to see our third Beis HaMikdash, but say, you know what's going to come out? What's going to come out is like 2,000 years of pent-up pain. 2,000 years of, it's almost like, you see this sometimes when people compete in like these long-term races also, sometimes like they get to the finish line and they begin to cry, because they've been nursing injuries and pain and difficulty the whole time, but they kept it together because they had to get to the finish line. When we get to our third Beis HaMikdash, and Amiras Hashem, we arrive at our national finish line, there's going to be just a tidal wave of tears, because the pain that we had to keep in check all of this time, because sometimes you have to keep pain in check because I need to move myself forward. And at the same time, just the unbridled laughter and joy that's going to come from seeing that Beis HaMikdash, from seeing Mashiach, and then Tchias HaMesim, and families being reunited, and all of these incredible things, we're going to see this. I will say it's important that we learn this, because what we're learning right now as a lesson in history, Amiras Hashem very soon is going to become our reality in the present. This profound mixture of pain for everything that we've had to endure, coupled with the incredible laughter and joy for everything that we finally have, we will be zoche to it Amiras Hashem bekarov. The Gemara says, "I v'hamazidin havu." Still, there's a problem. How are the Jews bringing a carbon to atone for avodah zarah? They were mazid. Remember again, a chatas is brought for inadvertent transgression. These Jews were not shogeg, they were mazid. So how could they bring a carbon for mazid? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Hora shah haisa. The Rabbi said, this is fascinating. Hora shah means an exception was made. An exception was made. Ultimately, Hakadosh Baruch Hu allowed them to go ahead and bring a chatos even for an intentional avir. Hachanai mistabra di'i lo teimahachi elim tishim v'shisha kvasim shiva v'shiva kineged mi. I'll say furthermore, because you look at these karbanos, these numbers are very interesting, right? There are 96 elim, 77 kvasim. What are they corresponding to? Ella horas shaisa haya hakanami horas shah haisa. So I'll say, so ultimately it was horasha. Harasha. I will say, by the way, you'll ask yourself, why was there harasha to Allah? In other words, so just say, let it go, let's move on. I will say, because if there's one thing, and this is so incredibly important for this time of year as well, if there's one thing that the Ribono Shel Olam has a vested interest in, it is us becoming Bali Tshuva. No one is a greater stakeholder in our tshuva than HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because when we become Bali Tshuva, we believe in our ability for second chances. We believe in our ability for second chances, we get our act together and we live differently going forward. If tshuva is not a possibility, then we'll say, what's the point of trying? Kadosh Baruch Hu needed Klal Yisrael to understand that the second Beis HaMikdash represented a new start, a new opportunity, a new beginning. So sometimes for people to really believe that they have a new beginning, there has to be something concrete. So the ability for Klal Yisrael to bring these chatas offerings was a tangible display. HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives you. You're bringing a carbon chatas. But 1 second, only a shogeg brings a chatas. Not amazing. Horayos shah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, it's okay, here I'm allowing you to do it. When Klal Yisrael brought those karbanos, they knew with certainty that they had been forgiven and that a new chance had been given. Incredible. Tana Banon. Meis echa minat tzibur chayavin. So we'll say nothing more close. This interesting brisa. Meis echa minat tzibur chayavin. So we'll say, so remember again, this is all par ha'elam davar minat tzibur, right? All the same thing, right? Beis Din goes ahead and delivers an erroneous ruling. People rely on it. There's this whole carbonic process. What happens? Meis echa minat tzibur chayavin. If one of the members of Klal Yisrael died, they're chayiv. Now again, we don't know who's chayiv. We're going to see what this means. Meis, Gemara says, mi Beis Din p'turin. Ultimately, again, if one of the members of the Beis Din dies, then ultimately, again, they are pater. So the Gemara says, Man Tana, who is the Tana of here? Amrav Chista, Amrav Yizera, Amrav Yirmiyah, Amarav, Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Meir. The Amar, what did Rabbi Meir say? The Amar Beis Din Mevin V'lo Tzibor. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion, I will say, which is, by the way, is going to be the Halacha L'Maisa opinion. Rabbi Meir holds that when it comes to Par Helam Davar Minat Tzibor, ultimately, again, only the Beis Din brings, and not the congregation. Now watch this. The Gemara says, Chilchach, Meis Echa Minat Tzibur Chayavin. The Ha Chaim Kulei Beis Din. Therefore, again, if one of the members of Klal Yisrael dies, they still bring the par because the Beis Din is intact. However, Meis Echad Mi Beis Din P'turin, the Havile Chatas Shemeis Echad Min HaShotzfin, or Mishum Hachi P'turin. But I will say, but this is interesting. But if one of the members of the Beis Din died, then what? Then it's interesting. The Gemara suggests that Allah L'Maisa, the Beis Din no longer brings the par. Right? Why? Because if one of the members of the Beis Din dies, this is like a chatos that was owned by partners, where if one of the partners dies, the chatos is no longer brought. Very interesting. The Gemara says, Maskif Rav Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, there are Beis Din imat tzibor, but we can say something Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that Allah L'Maisa, par halam tzibor is brought both by the Beis Din as well as by the tzibor. Therefore, Meis Echa Minat Tzibor Chayavin. De'in Tzibor Meisim. If one of the members of the Tzibor dies, you still bring the par. Why? Because like we said, the Tzibor never dies. Tzibor never dies. Meis Echad Mi Beis Din. But if one of the members of the Beis Din died, P'turin, Kidar Minan, Dechatos Shutfenhi. Okay? Amar Le Abaye, Shamina Rabbi Shimon Amar Chas. So now, interestingly enough, so what the Gemara is just suggesting is as follows. If one of the members of the, if a member of Klal Yisrael dies, we still bring the par. Right, because again, ain't Sibor, ain't Misa but Sibor. The interesting what's being introduced over here is that, so let's just play this out. Beis Din Paskin that Chaylev is mutter. Okay, fine. I mean, not okay, bad. Right? People acted on it. Now Beis Din has to go ahead and bring a par ha'alam davar minat Sibor. Okay? Now whether or not the Sibor brings or not, that's a machlokes. It's a machlokes that we've seen before. Now one of the members of the Beis Din dies. The Gemara is suggesting that the Beis Din will no longer bring the chatos. It can't, I should say differently, it can't bring the chatos. Why can't it bring the chatos? Because the parallel davar minat tzibor is like a chatos of partners. Chatos owned by partners. And the halacha is that when one of the partners dies, the remaining part, the chatas can no longer be brought. Okay, so the Gemara says, is that true? Is that true? The Gemara says, I'm sorry. Maskif lo Rav Yosef, v'nokol Rabbi Shmuel. Fine. Kedamin l'chad shufenu. Amalei Abaye, shemin Rabbi Shimon l'chatas shufin mesa. When Rabbi says, according to Rabbi Shimon, we understand that a chatas shutfin is not left to die. It's not left to die. This animal said, remember again, understand, the chatas of an individual, so like we said before, Reuven brings the chatas, Reuven is obligated to the chatas, he separates an animal and then he dies. What happens to that animal? What happens to that animal? You leave it to die. You can't do it, you can't go ahead. Chatas shemesu ba'ala. If you have a chatas and its owner died, you can't offer up that chatas. Now, listen to this. Interestingly enough, what about a chatas owned by partners? By partners. So again, it could very well be that you can't offer up that chatas, but is it left to die? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon says, it's not left to die. Desanya, par v'shashem kippurim, sha'avdu, listen to this. If you have the par and the sar of Yom Kippur, so you separated out these animals, Baruch service on Yom Kippur. Then what happened? Sha'avdu, lost the animal. By the way, someone's losing their job, right? Someone's losing their job. Right? So they lost the par and the sar of Yom Kippur. So what do you do, Bosai? What do you do if you lose the par and the sar of Yom Kippur? You separate out another set. Okay, fine. Now, Bosai, now the unwritten part of the story over here is they offer up the replacement, and then what happens? They find the old ones or the original ones. What's the halacha? Yamusu kulan. You leave them to die. You leave them to die. Rabbi Shimon says no. Yiru, you have to let them graze, and then they develop a mum, and then you could redeem it. Why? Lefi shein chatas tzibor mesa. Ultimately, again, because the chatas of the congregation is not left to die. Amalei Rav Yosef, kohanim ka'amrit. So we'll say that's kohanim. The Gemara says, shiny kohanim deikru kal. Kohanim themselves are called the congregation. So that is not looked at. Interestingly enough, that par and sawyer, that's not looked at as karbanos of chatas of partners. That's what we thought it was originally. That's the karbanos of kohanim. Kohanim are considered to be a klal. The Gemara says, "Dichsiv ala kohanim va'al kol am hakahal yichaper." So you see, kohanim are called the kal. We'll say amud beis elamiata naisu par bahora. If that's the case, ultimately again, that kohanim are called a kahal, then ultimately again, they should bring their own par helam davar minat tzibur, because they're called the kal. The chitema hachinami. If that's the case, maybe you'll say they will. They can't do that. Why? Tafilu v'shvatim. Now, let's remember again, according to the opinion that says that when there is a mistake and the Beis brings a par and the shvatim bring a par, so how many paros is that? That's 12. If the kohanim are considered to be their own kahal, then what? How many should you bring? 13. The Gemara says, no, here's the difference is, the shevet of Levi is not called a kahal. This is very interesting. Why not? Tichsiv, hineni mafrecha v'her b'sicha v'nasaticha lekal amim. So Rabbi say, this is interestingly enough by Avram Avinu. Right? Hashem says to Avram Avinu, I will give you, I'll make you great, I'll multiply you, I'll make you into a kal amim. Now, right after that, it says, V'nasati es ha'aretz hazos. So what do you see from here? Being a kal is associated with Eretz Yisrael, which Rabbi said, by the way, remember we learned this last week already, that only the Jews in Eretz Yisrael are called Kahal Yisrael. So interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Kol sheyesh la'achuza ikri kahal. Only those who have a portion in the land, ultimately again are called kahal. V'chol she'ein lo achuza, whoever does not have a portion in the land, lo ikri kahal, is not called kahal. So both say, so this is really fascinating. So therefore, again, interestingly enough, Shevet Levi isn't called kahal. Why not? Why not? Because at the end of the day, they don't have land. Which I will say, by the way, it's interesting. It almost seems like what it's saying is like, what's the pshat? Okay, you can say, what's the pshat? This, if you don't have a portion of the land, you're not part of the kal of Yisrael. So obviously, you can say it's a pasuk. I think on a deeper idea, what it's saying is like this: to be part of Kahal Yisrael, what has to happen? You have to have responsibility for the actual advancement of the land. If you don't have responsibility for the advancement, you're holy, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, but that's not Kahal, right? Kahal Yisrael are people who roll up their sleeves and advance the common agenda of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. If you're not working the land in some way, in other words, if you're not advancing the land of Eretz Yisrael, then ultimately, again, you're not part of the Kal. Now, again, not being part of the Kal doesn't mean you're not beloved. It doesn't mean you're not holy. I'll say, bad news is we're also not part of the Kal, right? In other words, but yet again, we're holy, we're beloved, we're part of Klal Yisrael, but the Kal is something very specific. So the Gemara says, Imkain, Chashu Yebei Shvatim. Here's the problem. If Shevet Levi is not part of the Kahal, then I will say, then again, how are you ever coming up? How are you ever coming up with 12 Shvatim, right? Again, that means ultimately at the end of the day, there's only 11. There's only 11. So the Gemara says, no. Ephraim Umenashe, Keruven v'Shimon Yuli. No, there are 12 Shvatim. Why? Why Abosai? Because ultimately, again, Yosef becomes 2. Yosef becomes 2. Amar Rava, Abosai, by the way, is fascinating. Amar Rava, V'haksiv al Shem Acheim Yikaru Benachal Asam. But by Ephraim and Menashe, Abosai, it says that, listen to this. Yes, Ephraim and Menashe are 2 tribes. What are they 2 tribes for? Lenachal Hokshu V'lo Davar Acher. Ephraim and Menashe are considered to be 2 tribes for tribal inheritance, for inheritance purposes, right? For land purposes, but not for any other purpose. The Gemara says, no, is that not true? Is that true? But I will say again, Ephraim and Menashe were different in the desert when we had flags. So remember again, Ephraim and Menashe had their own flags. So they are separate tribes. I will say, because remember again, the flags had to do with where tribes camped, which also had to do with Nachala, tribal inheritance. It's all part of the same thing. I have Hachalukim bin Asim, but Ephraim and Menashe each had their own Nasi, each had their own tribal prince. So Gemara says, Hahu Lachlok Kavalin Asim. That was in order to give kavod to Nasi. I will say, or in other words, to say differently, that was in order to avoid machlokes. If there was only one Nasi for Ephraim and Menashe, you could understand that's going to cause problems. Who does the Nasi come from, right? Which one of them should get the Nasi? The Sayan Bus is very beautiful. Shlomo asa Zayin Yemei Chanukah. So ultimately, it says Shlomo made 7 days of Chanukah. Now what is that for Chanukah? What? Chanukah Sabayis. Where Shlomo consecrated the Beis HaMikdash, he made 7. Actually, this he really made 7 and 7. But we saw this last week. He made 7 primary days of dedication. Uma ra'u Moshe lasos shnei masar. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu make 12? Why did he make 12? The Gemara says, this is by the Mishkan. Why were there 12 days of inauguration by the Mishkan when Shlomo HaMelech only made 7 days by the Beis HaMikdash? Kadei lachlok kavod l'nesiyim. Ultimately, in order to give kavod to the Nesiyim. Because they'll say, what would have happened? First off, it only would have been 7. So which tribal princes are represented, which are not? So what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? Prolong ultimately again the dedication this way. Every tribal prince ultimately again gets a part, which I will say is a really, really incredible idea. What do you see from here? That Moshe Rabbeinu was preoccupied with Shalom. With Shalom. So if you need to extend the Chanukah Samishkan a little bit longer, ultimately again, that's what we'll do just in order to make Shalom amongst the Nisiyim. Absolutely incredible. Says the Gemara, my Havi Allah. So we'll say, now the Gemara goes back to its original question. Let's get back on track over here. My Havi Allah, the Gemara says, what is the status of Chatos Hashutfin? So here's what we know. The Chatos of an individual, right? Reuven accidentally was Mechal Shabbos. He separated a Chatos and then he died. What happens to that Chatos? What happens to it? It's left to die, right? If the Tzibor has a Chatos and some members of the Tzibor die, what's the halacha? The Chatas is still offered, right? Why? Ein Misa B'Tzibor. The raya to that, the Jews who came back for the second Beis HaMikdash. Our interesting question is, what if you have a Chatas owned by 2 people? You have Chatas owned by a partnership, and one of the partners dies, what's the status of that Chatas? Is that like a Chatas HaYochid or a Chatas HaTzibor? To which the Gemara says, that's what it means when it says, My Havi Allah, Tashma. So it's a very interesting conclusion here. Tashma, the Sanya. Rabbi Shimon says, Chamish Chataos Mesos. There are 5 categories of chatos that ultimately, again, are left to die. What are those 5 chatos? Vlad chatos. If your chatos Mazel Tov gives birth, right? So if your chatos gives birth, ultimately, again, that chatos is left to die, right? Tmuras chatos. If you exchange one chatos for another, tmura. And I will say, by the way, well, we'll see why this is. Chatos shemesu ba'ala. If you have a chatos and the owner of the chatos died, the chatas sheniskapru ba'aleha, or you have a chatas whose owner achieved atonement through another animal. So this would be a case of, let's say again, Reuven was mechal Shabbos accidentally, set aside a chatas, lost his chatas, designated another chatas, offered up the replacement chatas, and then found the original chatas. So the original chatas is left to die. The chatas she'avra shnasa, or Rabbi say in a chatas, there's an age requirement within a year. If the chatas aged out, okay. V'yata yochol lomar vlad chatas. Sorry, v'yata. So now the Gemara goes through this. V'yata yochol lomar vlad chatas b'tzibor. So if you're dealing with a tzibor, chatas tzibor, there's no such thing as offspring of a chatas. Why not? Shein tzibor mafrishin nekeva. Because again, whenever the tzibor goes ahead and brings a chatas, it's only a male animal, never a female animal. So if Rabbi say again. Just this is important because in 2025 you have to clarify these things, right? So only females can have children, right? Only females can nurse, only females can menstruate, only females, right? So again, there are certain biological realities that are only for females that men cannot do, right? So therefore, again, the Gemara says, so by tzibor, there's no such thing, because at the end of the day, ultimately, again, by a tzibor, it's only a male chatas, not a female chatas. V'yata yochol lomar tmuras chatas b'tzibor, and ultimately, again, there's no such thing as a tmuras chatas b'tzibor. Why not? Shein tmura b'tzibor, because we said the concept of tmura only applies by, and remember again, tumura means when you exchange a sacrificial animal. So the halacha normally is, if you exchange sacrificial, there's a penalty. Vayahu usmurasa kodesh l'Hashem. Both the original animal and the exchange animal both become kodesh. The tumura doesn't work by communal offerings. That is xeris hakas. Gemara learns that from the pasuk. Okay. Next, v'yata yokolomar chata shemesu ba'aleh. Furthermore, again, by a chatas hatzibor, there's no such thing as the owner dying. Why not? She'ein tzibor mason. Because as we saw before, emisa b'tzibor, there's no death by the tzibor. Shenis kapru ba'ala v'she'abra shnasa lo shamanu. Shabbos, I say, interestingly enough, the two cases that we don't know by a tzibor is shenis kapru ba'ala. What happens if there was a katas at tzibor that it was lost? The owners went ahead and got a replacement animal. They achieved atonement through the replacement. Then they find the original. What's the status of the original animal? And she'avra shnas, or if it aged out. So those are two cases ultimately, again, where we don't know the halacha by chatas atzibor. So lo shamanu. So we don't know what the halacha is over there. So yakol yamusu. So you might have thought ultimately, again, they should be left to die. So the Gemara says, Amrit yilmot sasam min amfurash. Ultimately, again, we should learn the unknown cases from the known cases. How so? Mamatzinu bevlat chatas atmuras chatas shemesu ba'aleh biyachid dvarim amurim v'lo b'tzibor. So we'll say maybe we should say just like the first three only apply to individual tzibor, individual chatos, and not to communal chatos. So to again the remaining two, which apply to an individual, shouldn't apply to a tzibor. So 1 second, that's not fair. Why? Why is that not fair? Because at the end of the day, remember again, some of these cases are simply not possible by a tzibor, as we already saw. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, Bechad Makom Gamir. So we'll say, bottom line, the Gemara says that Halacha L'Maisa, Rabbi Shimon says is like this. These 5 cases of where a chatas was left to die, they're a unit. Now, what does that mean they're a unit? Either they all apply or they all don't apply. So therefore, Halacha L'Maisa, Rabbi Shimon says is like this. Since when it comes to chatas atzibor, already out of the gate, 3 of them don't apply, right? Vlad chatas doesn't apply because by a chatas sibur you only offer up male animals, right? Tmuras chatas doesn't apply because there's no tmura ultimately again by a communal chatas or by a chatas owned by a communal offering, and ultimately again chatas shemesu ba'aleh doesn't apply. Why not? Because in misa b'tzibor, once those 3 don't apply, then by definition the other 2 don't apply as well by a chatas tzibor, and therefore ultimately again, if you have a case of a chatas tzibor where they lost the animal, went ahead and offered up a new animal, and then found the original one, you do not let the animal die, but rather again you let it graze, develop a mum, and then redeem it. Same idea. Ultimately, if it ages out, halacha l'maisa, you don't leave it to die. Rather, you go ahead and let it graze, develop a mum, and then sell it. So halacha l'maisa, those five situations where chatas are left to die, The only time you apply it is if you could apply all 5. If you could apply all 5, great, fantastic. If you can't apply any part of the 5, then by definition, the remaining ones do not apply as well. As we close out the parak of Par Elam Davar Minat Tzibur, it is important, just one piece of halacha l'maisa to understand, we pass on Rabbi Meir, namely that by Par Elam Davar Minat Tzibur, who is offering it? One par offered up by Beis Din. One par offered up by Beis Din. Rabbi say, now what that does, and again, what that does mean, and this is very important, is if after the transgression was recognized, so again, Beis Din said, halacha l'maisa, again, you could eat chaylev. Right, so Klal Yisrael went out, some majority of Klal Yisrael went out, or somebody went out and ate chaylev, the majority of Klal Yisrael went out and ate chaylev, and then it was discovered. So the Beis Din brings a par. The rest of the Shvatim they're covered by the par of the Beis Din. If one of the members of the Beis Din dies, before the par is offered, then the par is not offered. Again, that's the technicality. If one of the members of the group does die before the par, then the par not be offered. But Allah, again, Pastor Meir, one par full of Klal Yisrael offered up by the Beis Din. They both say, Hajjun Allah, Choru, Beis Din, Mazel Tov. On finishing our first parak in Maseches Horayos, what a parak it was. Tomorrow, the adventure continues. Shkoyach. All right, Chavradim, have a great day, everyone.